Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live for 600, 700, or even 900 years? It sounds incredible, doesn't it? But in the Bible, there are accounts of people who lived exactly that long, almost a millennium. Now the big question arises, are these ages really real? How is it possible for someone to live for so long? Was time measured differently back then, or was there some hidden secret in those days that made people live so long? In today's video, we will explore these fascinating stories from the Old Testament together and discover what might be behind this surprising longevity. This is a mystery that has intrigued scholars for centuries. Stay until the end of this video, because this understanding will surprise you. First, we need to understand that the Bible does not give us a clear explanation of why people lived for so long in ancient times. What we do know is that, in a specific part of human history, people could live for more than 900 years. This period was before the Great Flood that destroyed humanity, as recorded in the book of Genesis between chapters 6 and 8. According to what is written, it was common for people at that time to live for hundreds of years. For example, Adam, the first man created by God, lived for 930 years, as recorded in Genesis 5:5. Methuselah, known as the man who lived the longest in the Bible, reached an impressive 969 years, as mentioned in Genesis 5:27. Although the Bible does not provide a clear explanation of why people lived so long back then, many scholars and theologians have proposed different theories to try to understand this issue. One of the most common theories suggests that time might have been counted differently in ancient times, with years being calculated differently compared to the calendar we use today. However, this theory loses strength when we examine historical records and the timekeeping systems of ancient civilizations. From the earliest records of humanity, years have traditionally been measured in cycles based on the phases of the moon and the seasons of the year. For example, around 5,000 years before Christ, some civilizations were already using 365-day calendars, adjusted according to the phases of the moon. The Bible, when speaking about the longevity of people in the Old Testament, such as the advanced age of biblical figures like Adam, Noah, and Methuselah, does not mention any changes in the way time was measured. Instead, it seems to follow the already known pattern of complete years, like the ones we use today, without any indication that the years were shorter or counted differently. Therefore, the idea that people lived for hundreds of years in the Old Testament due to a different way of measuring time is not a widely accepted theory. Other people believe that the ages mentioned in the Old Testament were not counted differently, but that the numbers could have a symbolic or figurative meaning. Those who support this interpretation suggest that the ages may not refer to the lifespan of an individual person, but rather to the duration of an entire family, clan, or dynasty. In this perspective, the name of a patriarch like Adam, Noah, or Abraham could represent an entire generation or community that lived and thrived during that time, not just a single person. This could explain the advanced ages in a more symbolic way, connecting them to the lasting influence of these figures on their communities over the centuries. However, interpreting these ages as symbolic instead of literal is not the only way to understand this issue, and there are other possible explanations. Within the biblical narrative, it makes sense to believe that, at the beginning of humanity, people really did live for many years, like the patriarchs whose ages are mentioned in the book of Genesis. This longevity can be understood in various contexts. Firstly, it can be related to the natural living conditions of that time, which were very different from those of today. In addition, many believe that this longevity was directly linked to God's divine plan for humanity. One of the explanations suggested by Old Testament scholars is that people lived for so long because the living conditions before the flood were very different from those of today. In this sense, It is said that, in the past, there was something in the Earth's atmosphere that helped protect life, allowing people to live for many years. The book of Genesis even suggests that before the flood, there was no rain, and the planet was covered by a layer of water, creating a different climate. Instead, the soil was irrigated by a mist that rose from the ground, creating a moisture cycle that sustained vegetation and ecosystems without the need for heavy rains. Genesis 2:6. This unique climate system may have created ideal conditions for humans and other living beings to thrive. The combination of a protective atmosphere, ideal climate conditions, and the genetic purity of the first human beings may have contributed to people living for centuries. However, the great change came with the flood, an event that drastically altered the earth and its conditions. According to the biblical account, the flood was an act of God's judgment on the increasing wickedness of humanity. When the floodgates of heaven were opened and the waters flooded the earth, Genesis 7:11, the atmospheric and climatic conditions that allowed such longevity were destroyed. The water layer that surrounded the earth, as suggested in the biblical account, likely dissipated during the flood, resulting in a drastically different world. From this point on, human longevity began to decrease considerably. Noah, who lived before and after the flood, lived for 950 years, but after him, we see a sharp decline in life expectancy. His descendants, like Abraham, lived for less than 200 years, and eventually, life expectancy was reduced to levels closer to those of today. Those who support this idea suggest that it may explain why, after the flood, people stopped living for so many years. Here a question arises: is it possible to prove this hypothesis biblically? No, because the Bible is not a scientific book. That is not its purpose. However, even among scientists, some say that, at some point in the past, a significant climate change altered the living conditions on Earth. According to this line of thought, people lived much longer at that time due to specific living conditions. Some scholars suggest that the longevity of people in the past may be linked to the fact that, in the early generations of humanity, the genetic code was purer. This means that many diseases and weaknesses did not yet exist among people. Furthermore, some believe that these stories about people living for a long time are merely biblical legends used to discredit religious accounts. However, that is not quite the case. Interestingly, ancient archaeological documents also mention people who lived for many years. One example is the Sumerian king list, which speaks of rulers with extremely long lifespans before a great flood. Although the ages recorded in these texts seem exaggerated, it shows that various ancient cultures believed that in times past, people lived much longer. Despite the possible differences in living conditions at that time, the longevity of the biblical characters in the Old Testament can also be understood according to God's plan. This means that even if there were natural or supernatural reasons for people to live so long before the flood, everything happened according to the divine purpose. God allowed human beings to live many years so that during this initial period, humanity could develop. Additionally, with longer lives, knowledge about God was preserved and transmitted from generation to generation. It's worth remembering that at that time, writing did not yet exist, and all knowledge was passed down through oral tradition. Thus, people who lived for many years played an important role in faithfully maintaining and transmitting this divine knowledge. For example, with Adam, his children and grandchildren living for hundreds of years, the knowledge of God was perpetuated consistently throughout the human lineage. In other words, a person born 800 years after the fall of man in Eden could still know the first man created by God and obtain from him all the details about divine revelation. Later, When God's purpose was fulfilled in this sense, naturally, the human life expectancy was reduced until it reached the normal standards of today. In other words, there was a gradual decline in people's life expectancy. From 900 or 800 years, they began to live 700, 600, 500, 400, then 300, 200, until it came close to 100 years, which is the maximum longevity recorded today. In the time of Abraham, around 2,000 years before Christ, people still lived for many years, often exceeding 150 years. Abraham, for example, lived up to 175 years, as recorded in Genesis 25:7. However, over time, especially by the time of Moses, around 1,400 years before Christ, humanity's life expectancy had decreased considerably. Moses, who led the people of Israel during the Exodus, lived up to 120 years, but that was already considered an advanced and exceptional age. The average lifespan of people at that time was between 70 and 80 years, as Moses himself mentions in Psalm 90:10. The days of our life rise to 70 years, or if we have strength, 80. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow. This psalm offers an interesting detail that contradicts the idea that, in biblical times, years were counted differently. If Moses, who wrote Genesis, where the long lifespans of the patriarchs, such as Adam and Methuselah, are recorded, also wrote that, in his time, people lived around 70 or 80 years, this shows that the counting of years was already consistent with the calendar of approximately 360 days. There is no indication that time was measured differently in the biblical accounts. On the contrary, the records show that people's life expectancy progressively decreased after the flood, which suggests that the earlier longevity was a specific feature of that period. The fact that Moses recorded both the long lives of the patriarchs in Genesis and the decrease in longevity in his own time is significant. It indicates that he was aware of this change and described it clearly in his writings. The longevity of people before the flood may be linked to special factors such as climatic and genetic conditions, as well as God's divine purpose for that period, while the shorter life in Moses' time reflects a new reality for humanity. Even knowing that longevity was no longer a reality for the people of his time, Moses made a point of recording that, in ancient times before the flood, human beings lived for hundreds of years. He narrated this directly and clearly in the book of Genesis, without giving any indication that these long lives were symbolic or represented the longevity of a dynasty, clan, or family lineage. Moses described longevity as a real and literal characteristic of the patriarchs, such as Adam, who lived for 930 years, and Methuselah, who reached an impressive 969 years, the longest recorded lifespan in the Bible. If Moses had intended for his descriptions to be understood figuratively, he likely would have provided some indication, such as the use of symbolic language, something common in other biblical texts when speaking of visions, parables, or prophecies. However, the ages mentioned in Genesis are presented objectively as part of an exact chronology that narrates the generations of humanity. Moses details not only the age of the patriarchs when they died, but also the age at which they had children, reinforcing the idea that he was speaking of individual lives and not dynasties or historical periods. This type of precision is significant because Moses was an author who lived many centuries after the period of these patriarchs. He recorded these accounts based on oral tradition and preserved records, and knew that the longevity of people in his time, about 70 or 80 years, was much shorter than in ancient times. Even so, he showed no doubt in reporting these long lives. This suggests that for Moses and the Israelites who received his writings, The extreme longevity of the early men was accepted as a historical fact, part of the story of creation and humanity before the drastic decline in living conditions after the flood. The fact that Moses recorded these ages without suggesting any form of symbolism reinforces the seriousness with which the ancient Israelites treated their history and tradition. The very context in which Moses lived also supports the literalness of these numbers. In his time, he was leading the people of Israel through the desert after freeing them from slavery in Egypt. It was a time of direct revelations from God to the people, with miracles such as the parting of the Red Sea, the manna falling from the sky, and the presence of God on Mount Sinai. This environment of direct contact with the divine could influence the view that, in past eras, God's blessings included extraordinary longevity. Moreover, Moses lived up to 120 years, an age far above the average lifespan of his time. His own life serves as an example that longevity, though no longer common, was still possible under God's blessing. However, he was clear in saying that generally the people of his time lived between 70 and 80 years, and that this period was already marked by trouble and sorrow. This creates a strong contrast with previous generations, where lives of 900 years or more were common, and highlights the difference between the world before and after the flood. Therefore, it seems reasonable to understand that Moses intentionally recorded the extremely long ages of the patriarchs as part of a historical account, not as a metaphor or allegory. The way he presents this information in the book of Genesis indicates that he treated this data as facts, transmitting them as an integral part of humanity's history. Although Moses did not offer a detailed explanation of why people reached such advanced ages during that period, he also leaves no room for figurative or symbolic interpretations. The absence of a direct explanation can be seen as a reflection of the theological perspective of that time. For Moses, and for many of his contemporaries, the primary focus was not on providing scientific or natural explanations, but on reporting events according to God's plan and will. Moses' central objective in recording these ages may have been to highlight the fulfillment of a divine purpose, where longevity served to allow humanity to establish itself and prosper during the early generations. Long lives could have facilitated the transmission of knowledge, especially since, at that time, writing was not yet widely used, and oral tradition was the main means of preserving a people's history and wisdom. Another important factor to consider is that the longevity recorded by Moses is directly related to God's plan for humanity and its relationship with sin. The Bible teaches that before the fall, man was created to live eternally in communion with God. With sin entering the world through Adam and Eve, death became a reality. But in the early generations, there was still an echo of that original perfection. Centuries-long lives may have been a reminder of God's initial design, in which humans were created for a long and blessed life. However, sin began to corrupt this longevity, and we see this in the gradual reduction of life expectancy over generations, culminating in the pattern of 70 to 80 years mentioned by Moses in Psalm 90. Even without explaining the specific reasons for longevity, Moses' record aligns with the broader theological context of the Bible, which suggests that the increase of wickedness in the world, especially after the flood, brought not only spiritual consequences, but also physical ones. The flood, seen as God's judgment on the corruption of humanity, also marked a turning point in the living conditions on earth. The atmosphere, climate, and survival conditions changed radically, which may have directly influenced the reduction of human longevity. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about the idea that people in biblical times lived for so many years? And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the upcoming videos.